I hope God protects us from seeing a Russian rebellion without sense or compassion. Those of us who plan impossible uprisings are either too young and don't know our people, or they are hard-hearted people who don't give a damn about their lives and the lives of others. To start off the new year, the ruling classes of the Russian Empire gathered to dine within the confines of luxury, but there would be little to celebrate. By 1917, the peoples of Russia had reached their breaking point. A lot was left desired after the culmination of the 1905 revolution. The peasants wanted land, women wanted rights, minorities wanted self-determination, progressives wanted democracy, and the socialists wanted power to the workers. The start of the First World War only served to exacerbate Russia's critical situation. Aside from the mounting pile of bodies, many of those left standing suffered from a lack of training, weapons, ammo, and even uniforms, with many soldiers charging into battle, wearing little more than rags. Behind the front lines, the situation was no better. Russia's underdeveloped rail network had been neglected and was struggling under the pressure of war. The factories had no fuel to run, and the bakeries had no wood to light their ovens. Thus, workers ran the risk of losing their jobs, and the women who stood in line all day couldn't get the bread that they needed to feed their families. People were getting hungry and ever more angry. It was only a matter of time until something went wrong. On the 23rd of February, 1917, which was International Women's Day, tens of thousands of women took to the streets of Petrograd's Beevor district to demand for better rations. It wasn't uncommon for large amounts of civilians to protest in wartime Russia. In fact, on the 9th of the same month, around 140,000 workers went out to commemorate Bloody Sunday. However, these demonstrations were always put down by brute force. But this time, it would be different. Just the day before, 30,000 workers from the Putilov factory had lost their jobs, further exacerbating tensions. As the women marched, they called out to the workers in nearby factories to join them, which they did. One of them, from the new Lesnar factory, recalls the crowd chanting, "Down with the war, down with the cost of living, no more hunger, bread for the workers." The protest grew to over 100,000 members, about a third of the city's labor force, and expanded to the Bolshaya-Nevka district. The Inter-District Committee, which was made up of Social Democrats, Mensheviks, and Bolsheviks, even called for a general strike, though the influence of prominent socialist figures was minor. As the day ended, many of them went back to their houses, but a minority decided to stay behind, and the more militant of the bunch tried to cross the Neva River in the direction of Nevsky Avenue and other symbolic locations. The largest groups were dispersed by the police, but the smaller ones managed to reach their targets and weren't going to leave until something changed. The Russian Revolution had officially started. By the 24th of February, the demonstrations had yet to disperse, and the soldiers that had been sent to deal with them were rather hesitant to do so. The only exception being the police and the Cossacks wearing their black uniforms and capes, but that would soon change. The 24th of February saw the crowd of protesters increase from anywhere between 150 to 200,000. Instead of working, the employees of Petrograd's factories organized assemblies and even militias, known as the Red Guards, to prepare for their next move. Nevsky Avenue and several other important arteries in Petrograd were under the control of an increasingly more radical group of protesters, many of whom were keen on overthrowing the Tsar. The Cossacks would often charge the protesters on horseback and beat them with their whips. The army troops, on the other hand, were much less violent, often letting the protesters pass without harming them. The men that made up Petrograd's garrison were forced to live in cramped conditions due to overpopulation, with the increasing threat that they will eventually be sent to the front lines. Many of the men were also sympathetic towards the demonstrators, especially the women, since they were often the widows of their fallen comrades. To calm down the masses, General Kabalov, commander of the Petrograd military region, claimed that there was enough grain to make bread for everyone, but this claim did little. On the 25th, confrontations between the protesters and the police intensified. Many of the factory workers wore thicker clothes and armed themselves with knives and other weapons in preparation to fight the police. Looting also increased, with many bakeries being gutted in search for anything to eat. The protesters started being joined by many university students who, aside from bolstering their numbers, served as speakers, leaders, and organizers. Even people from the middle class began joining the movement against the Tsar. Right beside the Luteny Bridge, a group of policemen confronted a group of workers in a violent brawl. The commanding officer was surrounded, dragged off his horse, and killed. The workers of the Vyborg district proceeded to burn down multiple police stations in their area, and many more officers were being individually attacked. In this critical moment, the government needed as many soldiers as possible if they wanted to hold back the masses, but their troops were growing even more reluctant to engage. The Cossacks were also refusing to help the police. In one such incident, in the Vostaniya Square, they attacked a group of police and even killed one of them. The first mutiny of soldiers occurred that day when several men of the Pavlovsky Regiment refused to follow orders and even killed their commanding officer. However, they were all detained and put on trial. Various political leaders and members of the government soon started discussing the situation. The socialists, as expected, were more than happy to start a revolution, while most of the progressives wanted an extensive series of reforms. The State Duma, on the other hand, was a lot more hesitant to act and focus on sustaining the war effort. Rodzyanko, who was the president of the Duma, telegraphed Tsar Nicholas, urging him to form a government that the people could trust. However, Nicholas viewed this as a waste of time and instead ordered General Kavalov to put the protests to an end by the next day. Kavalov's troops had mostly used non-lethal measures to combat the demonstrators, but with Nicholas's order, things were only going to get more deadly. On the 26th, the demonstrations commenced on a sunny winter day, which was a nice change of pace compared to the cold days of the Russian winter. But when they took to the streets, they were greeted by soldiers who had orders to put their low rebellion to an end. At first, the troops tried dispersing the demonstrators with whips and swords. They soon resorted to bullets. One of the bloodiest confrontations that day took place at the Vostaniya Square, where the men of the Volinsky Regiment opened fire on a crowd, killing approximately 40 of them. Another incident in Nevsky Avenue, a group of soldiers were forced to fire at the crowd after being surrounded. Rodzyanko once again sent a telegraph to Nicholas, urging him for reforms. Not only was he ignored for the second time, but Nicholas also ordered the suspension of the Duma till April. That night, the soldiers of the Volinsky Regiment returned to their barracks, heavily affected by what they had done. Most of them were new recruits from Petrograd itself, and didn't want to continue shooting at the protesters. They soon started to debate amongst themselves on what they should do. According to one famous source, Sergeant Kirpichnikov convinced the rest of the NCOs to refuse to shoot at the workers. The next day, when the officers of the Volinsky Regiment, stationed in the Tavarichevsky barracks, found their men assembled in the armory's courtyard, the men began to shout, "We won't shoot." The officers then threatened them, to which the troops responded by banging the butts of their rifles against the ground. When the officers realized that their troops had mutinied, they fled the base. An isolated shot even killed one of the commanders. While most of the garrison didn't join the protesters, it only took a few of them to change the course of history. Gunshots were soon heard throughout the whole of Petrograd, first in isolated incidents, and then in salvos. Rodzyanko once again sent a telegraph to Nicholas, telling him that the situation had deteriorated, and that the fate of Russia was at stake. Once again, he was ignored. The protesters began moving towards the Taurid Palace, where the Duma would meet. Conveniently, the Tavarichevsky barracks were just across the street. The Volinsky Regiment soon convinced the Preobrazhensky Regiment to join the revolt. A fierce battle took place at the Litany Bridge between armed workers and rebel soldiers against a few loyal servants of the Tsar. The revolutionaries, as I will be calling the protesters from now on, marched towards the Peter and Paul Fortress and other detention centers to release prisoners. Of course, this wouldn't be Russia if people didn't start drinking excessive amounts of vodka, which a crowd of 3,000 did after storming a distillery in Alexandrovsky Prospect. The Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich, who was the younger brother of Tsar Nicholas, urged him to allow for a new cabinet of ministers headed by the liberal Prince Love. Even his wife started urging him to make concessions. Since the Duma had been disbanded, Rodzyanko was fearful that the socialists would dominate the power vacuum left in its wake. So he, along with 10 progressives and 2 socialists, one of which was Alexander Kerensky, formed the Provisional Committee of members of the Duma for the restoration of order. In another room within the same palace, various socialists, mostly moderate Mensheviks, formed their own little assembly called the Temporary Revolutionary Committee of the Soviet and Workers' Delegates, and asked for people to elect representatives. Kerensky was also part of this, being elected vice president of the Soviets. In the late hours of that day, Tsar Nicholas realized just how dire the situation was and ordered General Ivanov to assemble a force to march on the capital, but things wouldn't go exactly as he planned. On the 28th, Tsar Nicholas, who was in Mogilev, Belarus, leading the army, boarded the imperial train and headed towards Tsarskoye Selo. However, he had to make a detour towards Pskov because the railway workers had blocked the tracks. Back in Petrograd, one of the first things that the Petrograd Soviet did was implement Order Number 1 on the 1st of March, which basically diminished the authority of officers, got rid of the armed forces' strict discipline, and gave the soldiers some dignity. This was incredibly popular amongst the troops, who were fed up with being treated inhumanely. For those unaware, officers had the authority to beat their men at the slightest mistake and even execute them for disobedience. There were also restrictions forced on the soldiers, such as not being allowed to smoke in public areas, use public transport, and even being prohibited from going to parks. While the Tsar was still stuck in Pskov, several prominent members of the military and a bunch of soldiers recognized the Provisional Committee. However, they would still have to compete with the Petrograd Soviet over legitimacy as government. The Executive Committee of the Soviet, also known as the Ispolkom, gave the Provisional Committee a list of demands, which in their majority were guarantees for civil liberties and the commitment to elect a constitutional assembly, all of which were accepted. After some negotiation between the two parties, the provisional government was created on the 2nd of March. The new government was headed by Prince Love and was dominated by other progressives, mostly from the PKD, or the Cadets, led by Pavel Miluikov. The Petrograd Soviet promised the support of the provisional government if they got to approve some of its policies. The news of what happened in Petrograd soon spread throughout the whole country, especially to the cities that were connected by rail and telephone lines. Some local authorities tried to censor this news, but were unsuccessful, soon being overthrown by their own local revolutions. All over Russia, people started establishing their own public committees and Soviets with little to no resistance. In a few isolated cases, such as in the city of Tver, north of Moscow, the revolution was followed by reprisals against army officers and public servants. The only thing that they needed to do now was answer one last question: what do we do with the Tsar? Not everyone wanted to get rid of him, instead opting for a constitutional monarchy. Unfortunately for them, they were in the minority. The time to save the Tsar was long over, and now most progressives and all of the socialists wanted him out. The same day as the provisional government's inauguration, Tsar Nicholas was still stuck in Pskov. The higher-ups in the army, who had decent relations with reformist elements, gave their support for the provisional government to help maintain order. The officers that were stuck with him in Pskov told him that the Duma had taken control of the country. After a long discussion with the officers, Nicholas finally accepted the fact that he was no longer in charge. General Ruski would communicate with Rodzyanko in the name of the Tsar. Rodzyanko told him that it was best for Nicholas to abdicate in the favor of his son, Alexei's. While Nicholas may have been an incompetent ruler, there is one good thing that I can say about him, and that is that I loved his family. If he were to abdicate in favor of his son, then he probably would have had to go into exile alone, leaving him, and perhaps his wife and daughters, in a country that looked like it was about to fall apart. Instead, he opted to abdicate in favor of his younger brother, the Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich. Mikhail was uncertain that he could survive as Tsar, and after a reunion with various leaders of the provincial government, he denied the crown because they couldn't guarantee his safety. With that, over 300 years of Romanov rule finally came to an end. In the wake of the February Revolution, Russia became a very different place. There was a sense of freedom that affected everyone, and hope for a brighter future. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The fear of a counter-revolution was an ever-present thought in the heads of many, even if over-exaggerated. This, along with both desires of justice and revenge, led to many people being murdered, especially army officers and landlords. Russia was still engaged in a war that was draining their resources and causing problems in the rear. The Germans, in an attempt to take advantage of the situation, dropped leaflets from a plane over the front lines, claiming that the British were behind the overthrow of the Tsar. But since they failed to realize that most Russian soldiers hated him, it only made the British even more popular, according to one of the officers stationed in Galicia. Despite all the progress that they made, the provisional government was unable to satisfy the demands of the public. The ideals of the February Revolution, those being democracy, or at least their understanding of it, freedom of speech, self-determination, worker supervision of factories, land for the peasants, and an end to the war, were almost all crushed by the Bolsheviks when they closed the Constitutional Assembly in November that year. In my humble opinion, it's sad seeing how the chance for Russia to break its cycle of autocracy was destroyed by a bunch of murderous lunatics. If only things had turned out differently, then maybe the lives of millions of people would have changed for the better.